Thank you, Eric. It's very nice to be here and very nice to see everybody out there and online. Some of you may have expected to see Lucia Lohman up here as first speaker. Unfortunately, she could not make it. And since I was coming to town, Eric graciously invited me to fill in her slot. So I'll be talking about something different. I really won't talk about Brazilian botany, but many of you know that Lucy is one of the most productive and creative neotropical botanists active right now. So it's too bad she couldn't come, but I'll see what I can do to keep your interest. I'm going to start out maybe not as systematic as some of you would have expected. And I thought I was going to go last in the symposium, not first, but since I'm going first, I'm going to give you some introduction more into the ecology and evolution of tropical plants and the animals that they interact with, and particularly these Heliconias and hummingbirds, which I've spent almost my entire career working on. I assume everyone can hear me out there? Okay, good. When we think about the diversity of life on Earth, we often think about numbers of species. We think about how many species they are, and those of us in this museum have spent much of our career trying to figure out exactly how many species are on the planet. And right now, we estimate 10 million, maybe 100 million. It's probably around 10 million, but we've only named 1.75 million of those, and that's all of life. That's not just plants. So we have a lot more work to do, and I think that's partly what this symposium is about in terms of inspiring us to finish the job and discover the rest of life on the planet. But there's more to the diversity of life than just numbers of species. And that's what I spent a good part of my career on, looking at not only, and I'm sure many of you out there as well, not only the numbers of species, if we're dealing with the flora, or we're dealing with the local region or a regional list of species, but we're also looking at the traits of species. And as taxonomists, we're constantly defining traits and characters. And we're also looking at species interactions. In my mind, this is what leads to not just the diversity of life or an understanding of the diversity of life, but really beginning to try to unravel the complexity of nature by looking at the numbers of species, the traits of those species, and the interactions of those species, both in their natural environments and now more and more in human-altered environments. So I'm going to give you some examples of work that I've done over the last decade or so, looking at these interactions between species, particularly in this group. Now, where's my pointer? Is it the center one here? Oh, there we go. Okay. I'm going to particularly focus on the things that you would believe that I would, or would maybe hope that I would be focusing on. And that's the group of plants called the gingibrales, very diverse in the neotropics, but actually diverse in the tropics around the world, including bananas, heliconias, gingers, prayer plants, Costaceae, some of you may know that family. And this first example is a study that I've been doing with Carlos Garcia Robledo. Some of you may know Carlos. He's now at University of Connecticut. He was a postdoc here. And we were interested in looking at the interactions between the representatives of the gingibrales at La Selva Biological Station in Costa Rica, a lowland tropical forest, and the Cephalolea beetles that are exclusively feed on the gingibrales in quite a diverse way. And botanists and zoologists had started out tracking these interactions by waiting for the beetles to come to the plants and then catching the beetles, naming them, and looking at these interactions and how diverse those interactions are. Carlos and I were too impatient, so we decided to use DNA barcoding to try to figure out these interactions, and I'm sure all of you know what DNA barcoding is. But what we did is we generated a DNA barcode library for all the plants and a library for all the animals, for all the beetles. And there are about 80 species of gingibrales and about 120 species of beetles, so it was complex. And then rather than waiting for the beetles to actually chomp down on the plant, we just took the beetles when we found them, we threw them in the Waring blender, we extracted their DNA, and not only could we identify the beetle, but we could identify all the plants in the guts of the beetles. So we immediately had an idea of who was eating what. And here we can just see these sorts of interactions. Here's the beetles over here, here's the host plants over here in a rough phylogeny. And what we found out is what you'd expect. There's some very specialized interactions, one species of beetle feeding on one gingibrales. There's some very complex interactions with many species of beetles feeding on a host. But when we got it all together, this complex interaction of beetles and plants was much more intricate and involved than we had thought when we first started out with 80 species of plants and 120 species of beetles. And here you can see both the numbers and also the traits of those beetles that feed on the plants that have particularly a lot of secondary compounds, and the interactions between both of these. So this is just an example of how not only do we count species, but we also have to know something about their traits and something about how they interact with each other in, as I said, natural and human-altered environments. Who cares about beetles? Well, I know Terry Irwin cared a lot about beetles, and we miss his input here at the museum. I'm going to focus now, get a little bit higher in the food chain there and talk about birds, and primarily hummingbirds and heliconias. There were some heliconias at La Selva in that last studies, but now I'm going to focus exclusively on some work we've been doing for quite a while now on the interaction between heliconias and hummingbirds, particularly the coevolution between heliconias and hummingbirds. So I'm going to show a few examples to begin with, just to whet your appetite of what the interactions between hummingbirds and heliconias are. And some of you have probably seen these videos, but you're going to have to suffer through them again because I think they're kind of nice. Anyway, this one is, the first example is a bronzy hermit hummingbird on Heliconia wagneriana, again in the Atlantic lowlands in Costa Rica. As you can see, the bird approaches the flower hovering. It has a long curved bill that exactly fits the long curved corolla of the flowers. The bird comes up, visits the flower, gets pollen placed on the head, sucks up nectar, gets its energy needs fulfilled, and also pollinates the flower in the process. But remember, it was a hovering bird. It got pollen on its head. It had a long curved bill that fit the long curved flower of Heliconia wagneriana. Here's a second example. This is a much more specialized hummingbird. This is called a sicklebill hummingbird. It's called a sicklebill because the bird is curved almost 90 degrees, and it specifically, here you can see the curvature, specifically fits this flower of Heliconia longa, which has the same sort of curved, extremely curved flowers. It's such an intricate interaction to get its bill into these curved flowers that it doesn't hover like the hermit did. It has to cling and perch on the flower to actually get its bill into the flower. Pollen gets placed on a slightly different part of the bird, but all the energetic needs of the birds are filled by this Heliconia and a number of other species. It's not exclusively on this Heliconia. Now here's the opposite of the sicklebill. This is the crowned woodnymph, and you can see immediately it's a much smaller bird. It's got a straight, short bill. Pollen gets placed on the bill itself. It's very easy for the hummingbird to get its bill into the flower, so we can hover and go from one flower to the next flower quickly, from one plant to the next. So the same sorts of flying behavior, insertion of bill in a specific type of flower that is adapted to that particular type of hummingbird. One more example that I can't resist, and this is a hummingbird, green hermit, in southern Costa Rica. This bird has learned to fly upside down and hover upside down to visit this particular Heliconia tortuosa near the Panamanian border. It goes on like this for hours. It has a long curved bill that fits the long curved flower of Heliconia, and it's this particular behavior that allows this specific interaction to occur. It's quite something. It can go on and on and on. I better stop it or get too tired. So that gives you some idea of the types of interactions that have evolved between heliconias and hummingbirds. Heliconias in the neotropics, and most of the species are neotropical, are exclusively pollinated by hummingbirds. Some other nectar robbers, bees and things, will visit the flowers, but the pollinators are hummingbirds. There's a few bat pollinated species in New Guinea and places. And the hummingbirds also are exclusively neotropical. There's about 300 species of hummingbirds, about 190 species of heliconias. And of course, the hummers visit other things besides heliconias. So I'm going to concentrate on the rest of the talk on this particular system that we've been studying in the eastern arc of the Caribbean islands, also known as the Lesser Antilles. And this is work, I should say right now, I've been doing with Ethan Temeles, who's a hummingbird ecologist at Amherst College, and also Vinita Gowda. Some of you may know her. She got her PhD working with me here at the museum and at GW. this is work that we've done over the last 10 or 15 years to try to understand what we thought was a very simple system. And we picked this system because it was simple. In the Caribbean here, there's only 2 species of Heliconia. There's 10 species at La Selva, so it makes it more difficult. And there's only 1 hummingbird in the Eastern Caribbean that actually visits these 2 species of Heliconia. So we thought, wow, we can really get some idea of how these species interact, what the characteristics that makes one adapted to the other, and so on. But immediately we found out the system was not that simple. It turns out the hummingbird, the purple-throated Carib, Anthracothorax jugularis, is sexually dimorphic. And here are, you can see the males. They actually have bigger bodies, even though it doesn't look this way. They weigh about 25% more than the females. They're relatively short, straight bills, and they visit Heliconia caribaea. The females of the purple-throated Carib have longer curved bills, a little bit smaller bodies, and they exclusively feed on Heliconia beehi. So right away, we begin to see how this specialization is occurring throughout the islands, with one sex of Anthracothorax visiting one species and the other sex visiting the second species. So this is sexual specialization of pollinators. Oh, and by the way, the flowers of the 2 species are adapted exactly to fit the bills of either the males or the females. Now, not only is their traits or their morphology specialized with one sex visiting one Heliconia and the other sex visiting the other, but their behavior is specialized as well. So here, let's look at Heliconia beehi, which I said is pollinated by the females. The female, and this Heliconia beehi generally occurs in the higher elevation forests, and they are trap-lining pollinators. In the forest, the Heliconias are scattered around here, and the females go from one plant to the next, to the next, to the next, in a regular pattern over the course of the morning and early afternoon, while they're getting nectar and while they're pollinating the flowers. It's a very specialized system there. And there are other birds that do this as well. If we look on the other hand at Heliconia caribaea, here, which is visited, as I said, almost exclusively by the male hummingbirds with the shorter, straighter bills. And these occur in the lowland elevations. And I'm particularly talking about the island of Dominica right now, right in the middle of that arc of islands. These birds don't trapline, the males don't trapline, they're actually territorial. And they defend large territories around big clumps of Heliconia caribaea, exclude all other birds, insects, females, males, banana quists, everything is prevented from entering the territory by aggressive behavior. So they're very aggressive territorial birds. Once in a while, and I'll get in more detail on this, they do let females come in, intrude into their territory, and I'll tell you what that's all about in a second. So let's look at one more video. This is something the BBC did. They were interested in what we were doing and came to the Caribbean, came to Dominica, and filmed this system. So here's Heliconia caribaea, the one visited by territorial males. There is some color polymorphism, and I'll go into that in a little bit. In a second, you'll see, well, there's the flowers sticking up out of the bracts. These are all modified leaves called bracts, and the flowers are inside. And here's the pollen. Here's the male. You can already see he's visited flowers. He's got pollen on his head. He's got a relatively short bill, but a long tongue. He's defending this territory around Heliconia caribaea. He comes in, he's hovering, visiting the flowers, sticks his bill in there, sucks up that nectar, and pollinates the flower. Here he is again. I'm going to show you another bird right now that they filmed. This is a female that's coming into the territory. And if you look closely, you could see that she had a much longer curved bill. She has to hover because for her to get that long bill and these short flowers, she has to hover. She has to perch to do it. Now here comes the male, chases her away, and sits back up on his little perch there and defends his territory. And here, look at that purple throat. Wow, pretty neat. So this is the system that we went there to study. First of all, we knew the birds were sexually dimorphic, and now we know how specific they are on the 2 Heliconias. But the more we looked, Ethan and Vanita and I, the more complicated this system got. It wasn't just a matter of, well, it's already pretty complicated with sexual dimorphism, behavioral dimorphism, trait dimorphism. But what we found in terms of this system when we started really watching the males is that there was more going on in that territory than just feeding the male. This is a typical territory. It had and we thought the males were defending this territory for their own energetic needs, but the more and the closer we watched, we found out that there was only one part of the territory that was sufficient and used by the male for energetic needs. In this case, this territory, he needed 188 flowers per day to provide his energy requirements. But there was another part of the territory that he equally defended that he never visited. And the more we watched, what we saw was he was defending this part of the territory simply as bait for females to come in to mate with. And so this part of the territory, some females would come in and he would chase them out. Other females would come in, he'd let them feed on these flowers, these specific flowers that he hadn't touched, and then he'd mate with the female, and then she would leave and go back up to the highlands. So here's a very specific behavior where the males are using the Heliconias as rewards to bring female into the territory. And so it's a much even more complex behavior between this, what looked like to be a very simple system got more and more complex as we looked at it. So the numbers were simple, but the traits got more and more complex. The interactions got more and more complex as we watched. I think I have a few more minutes. I hope, yeah, okay. So there's a lot more to do in the Caribbean. Well, let me show you what we're doing. What's so nice about the system, if any of you are on spring break and want to go to Dominica, which was great, these flower exactly during spring break every year in March and April. You could go to Dominica and find a patch of Heliconia on the roadside and see all this happening. It's didn't take a botanist and a hummingbird ecologist long to figure it out, but you can go and you can see this happening. It's pretty obvious. So let's look at the bigger picture in that eastern arc of islands. Again, here's St. Kitts in the north, going all the way down to Trinidad and Tobago and Grenada and all these islands. What I just was describing to you is what's going on in kind of the center of the distribution. And my impression was Heliconia caribaea, which is also found in the Greater Antilles in Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, and then comes down into the Lesser Antilles, just about as far as St. Lucia, and then drops out. On the other hand, Heliconia beehi is quite common, and I saw a photograph of this today, is quite common in northern South America, and then comes up through Trinidad and Tobago into Grenada, all the way up to about St. Kitts. It's where it's quite rare, most common, again, in the middle of the island. So the interactions I just described to you are where the two species come together. And so I always thought of this as displacement evolution, where selection by the hummingbirds made the two species diverge and were able to occupy the same habitats or very adjacent habitats, taking advantage of the two hummingbirds there. So we had it all figured out. Well, so here's an example, just for Heliconia beehi, which I said was common in South America and then enters the Caribbean and the Lesser Antilles and moves up. And it turns out in Trinidad, which we've done work on, there are 6 species of hummingbirds that visit Heliconia beehi. So it's a generalist in its southern range. As you go up to Dominica and a little bit further north, it becomes a specialist. It's only there visited, as I said earlier, by females of one hummingbird, so one sex of one hummingbird. The flowers are much are longer and more curved to fit those long curved bills of the hummingbird. So here you see the system, Heliconia beehi, large plants getting smaller as it goes up north into the islands. Corollas starting out small because it's visited by a lot of hummingbirds, getting larger as they go up. And here are the hummingbird visitors. Many species in the south, several species as they go north, going up to one sex of one species at its northernmost range. So again, the same thing happens with caribaea, but in the opposite direction. It starts out being pollinated by many hummingbirds in Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, and then it gets more and more specialized as it goes south. Generalization, specialization. So we thought it was a really good example of that sort of thing. So here we have it. We see the system here, caribaea coming down and beehive going up, and then enters phylogenomics. I had originally thought that Heliconia caribaea coming through the Greater Antilles into the Lesser Antilles was most closely related to Central American species of Heliconia, and that beehive was in South America related to South American species coming up. Well, we recently, with Monica Carlson, some of you may know her, she was a postdoc here, we've completed a molecular phylogenomic analysis, and lo and behold, here is beehive and caribaea as sister species in the middle of this clade, that all of these species are primarily South American. So caribaea is not related to something from Central America at all. And at the same time, we now have a hummingbird phylogeny. And here is Eulampes jugularis, or Anthracothorax jugularis, the purple-throated carib, the most specialized hummingbird in this whole group of hummingbirds. And its closest relatives are indeed in Central America. So when we start putting this together, we get a whole different picture of how this interaction has evolved. And to end, I'll just bring this. So here we have not caribaea coming down and beehive coming up. We have this common ancestor of beehive radiating from South America. And here's where all the action is. This is the origin of species, what we're actually seeing, and we haven't thought this all the way through, so there still is a lot of questions to answer. But what I think we're seeing is one species of Heliconia came up through the Caribbean from South America. This Anthracothorax jugularis came down from the Greater Antilles. They met in the middle, and suddenly there was this set of displacement. There was an actual speciation event, and beehive separated and gave rise to caribaea, and then caribaea continued indeed to move north into the Greater Antilles. So I think what we're seeing in this simple system, which is really kind of nice because it is simple, although it's the complexity of nature, we're seeing that if you look at these traits and you add the phylogenetic component on top of it and the evolutionary component, you could begin to understand how these things actually came about, and it could be an entirely different process than we originally thought. Just to end, our latest work in the Caribbean is taking on a different dimension, because this is kind of looking at natural systems, but what's happening now is the Anthropocene. Some of you may know the Caribbean is one of the most impacted regions in the Neotropics in terms of human impacts, in terms of climate change, hurricane intensity, hurricane frequency, invasive species. In this island of Dominica, and the system I just explained, we now have an invasive Heliconia from South America that has long flowers, longer flowers than any of the hummingbirds can visit, and it's starting to displace Heliconia caribaea. So I think these interactions that have evolved, in this case probably over millions of years, these islands are several million years old, are now being impacted by the Anthropocene. And so the next stage for those of you out there that want to continue some work like this is to see what the impact of humans are going to be on these pretty intricately co-evolved systems of hummingbirds and Heliconias. And I think I can stop there and take any questions if there are any questions. Thank you. Or comments. Your microphone is not on, I don't think. Oh, it is?
It is? Great, yeah. Oh, what was my question? But in any case, I think I wonder if the speciation events are even more complex. your final genomics sampled one of the beehive and one Caribbean, but you didn't sample the South American beehive. I wonder, if the Caribbean species are even different. The beehive, you may be dealing with different species. The final genomic sampling of beehive and Caribbean are from the Caribbean, right? Not from South America. Right. So I wonder if you are dealing with different species, if you sample South American ones, so the complexity is even higher. Is that possible?
Are you thinking about the genetic component of this? Is that
yes, the genetic component as well. Yeah.
That is very true. And our samples of beehive and Caribbean are both from the Caribbean. We don't have a sample yet from, so that's the next study that we need to do, is sample across, and I know we have a visitor from Venezuela in here that can get me some samples from Northern South America, and we can start looking at that in a more detailed way. I have a feeling with other species pairs of Heliconia, now that we know what species pairs are phylogenetically, we can begin to look at the same sort of pattern of specialization and generalization in other types of Heliconians.
But there always morphologically, the rates of evolution could be different too. Because we have seen Dendropanax in RLAC with this type of pattern, but really the South American ones are totally different from the Caribbean ones.
Thank you. Yep.
Nice, yeah.
You said the invasive species that's arriving is displacing some of the natives. I was wondering, without co-evolving with the pollinator, how is it pollinating, or is it spreading vegetatively?
The reason that Heliconia wagneriana is an invasive species, it doesn't need a pollinator. It's self-fertile and produces seed without anything visiting it, or possibly earwigs, or one of those, common insects that are in every flower in the Neotropics. And that's part of the problem. But it is displacing physically the native species that are the sole food of the hummingbirds. And if the hummingbirds can't get into the flowers of this invasive, that's going to have a major impact on the hummingbirds. So it's a good question. And we had to watch the invasive species for a while to realize that it was self-pollinating. Good question. Gary?
Yeah, we have a question online. The question is, in the gingers of La Selva, does the interaction between beetles indicate relationship among the plant species?
Yes, we were hoping that closely related beetles would be, we weren't hoping, we were expecting that closely related beetles might be visiting closely related Heliconias. And that's why I showed the phylogenies of both the beetles and the Zingiberales. And they're not. They're not. It seems to be, the genus is specialized on Zingiberales, but within the genus there's not a lot of specialization among closely related beetles on closely related plants. So there's a lot of selection going on in terms of what beetles can visit what things. So, and I want to sample this sort of system every 10 years and see what sorts of changes there may be in these specializations between, or these interactions between the beetles and the plants. Okay, head to Dominica. That's all I have to say. Oh.
I was just wondering, because female and male hummingbirds interact among each other of the same species, and you said that the male hummingbird defends the territory, and part of that territory is to attract the female. Is there any chance of hybridization between these two species, or are they dually specialized?
Yeah, between the two species of Heliconia, not the
That's
two
right.
sexes of hummingbird. There's a lot of hybridization between the two sexes of hummingbirds, I'll tell you that. Yes, there is some hybridization. As far as we find now, those hybrids are sterile. So there's not a lot of spread in the population. There's not a lot of reproductive spread. There's vegetative spread of these hybrids. And I didn't get into all the polymorphism, but you saw yellow and red beehives, yellow and red caribaeas. We're still trying to figure out what that's about. We think it's a simple Mendelian trait, but we don't know what the ecological or evolutionary significance. So more work to do. Thank you.